there's an entire title of the United States Code that automatically gets activated and makes the President of the United States of America a constitutional dictator, just like FDR was during World War II. We have not been in that situation yet, although we do know after 9/11, Bush did ask Congress to give him a formal declaration of war, and they refused to do so. They gave him a limited authorization to use military force.
But he showed them with the anthrax attack. He showed them with the anthrax attack a month later.
That's correct. They also had the USA Patriot Act, which is the blueprint for the U.S. police state. That was being held up in Congress by Senators Leahy and Daschle, and all of a sudden they got hit with super weapons-grade anthrax coming from illegal U.S. military stockpiles. And media sources also got hit to make it clear to the media that they better not be going after this story. So the media have already always go along with the cover-up on the anthrax. Yes.
Yeah, look, Dan Rather got some. It was all their enemies, the guys that took photos of Bush's daughters drunk here in Austin. They got hit.
Right. It was clearly an attempt to terrorize and intimidate the media. Not that they needed all that much intimidation to begin with, since they very rarely report the truth.
Is there any way to defeat this premeditated constellation of evil? I guess the general public has to stop being naive and realize that we have no future if we don't stand up against this. But I'm afraid, Dr. Boyle, it's going to go the way of Germany. People are going to have see the empire, launch World War III, invade all these countries, and then either this empire of evil will succeed or it's going to implode, and then we're going to get invaded by the Chinese. I mean, and people say, oh, that'll never happen. Well, I mean, if World War III starts and there's nuclear war, I mean, my God, I can just feel the gates of hell opening up in front of us.
Well, I'm afraid you're right. You know, if you read Huntington's Clash of Civilization, Huntington was ahead of me at Harvard. I went through the same program that produced that monster. And it does appear that the State Department the U.S. government has been following the blueprint set forth by Huntington in that article, later followed by a book. First take out the Arab and Muslim world, and then move on to China. And at the end of Huntington's book, it concludes with a nuclear war between the United States and China. And that gets into the deployment of all these ABM systems in Europe and around China, in Japan, Korea, whatever. If we strike first, these ABM systems are designed to pick up whatever might be left that the Russians and the Chinese send back at us.
And again, the Chinese president comes out and says, prepare for war with the U.S. I mean, our government is not moving all the nukes over there to play. I mean, it's insane. It is shocking to know America has been captured by evil, and that we now, Dr. Boyle, we are living in an aggressive, crazy empire that's got super weapons. I don't know. I mean, thank God the military has been blowing the whistle about the fake Iranian ambassador stuff and all the rest of it, and hopefully cooler heads will prevail. I mean, I've never been for a military coup because those are so dangerous, because you can get something just as bad, and I'm not endorsing that now, but I mean, you know, is there an Operation Valkyrie out there to stop this? Well, you can't, because it's not just a president. It's not Adolf Hitler. It's a whole crew of crooks in every position. How do you stop a cult of criminals that are power mad?
Well, I think you're right that the military, there are sensible people in there, unlike these neocons who are completely irrational, and they understand the consequences of what's happening. And we have to have more people, for example, like Admiral Fallon, who was head of U.S. Central Command and just publicly stated an attack on Iran was not going to happen on his watch. The military they take an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, and they have an obligation under the Uniform Code of Military Justice to refuse to carry out illegal and unconstitutional orders. And I think obviously you can't really expect, people at the bottom of the pyramid there. But I would hope that, people near the top of the military just start making it clear they are not going to carry out these orders because they believe they're either illegal, unconstitutional, or fatally dangerous. That is one hope we have. Meanwhile, we citizens simply have to get organized. We still have our First Amendment rights. We need protests, demonstrations, civil resistance, organization in these elections, whatever can be done to head off this catastrophe. We are not the Weimar Republic. We're far from it. But it's clear we're moving in that direction. And I don't know how much time we have. I agree with you on that.
Well, and the system knows once they've got a big war going, they can move us way past the Weimar Republic quickly.
Right. Once they get a formal declaration of war, we've all had it. It'll be just like what happened to Japanese Americans in World War II, the Korematsu case. And the Korematsu case is still good law. It's never been overturned by the United States Supreme Court. And indeed, officials of the Bush Jr. administration publicly stated that Korematsu is still good law. And we know that FEMA has the internment camps ready to go. So all they need is a formal declaration of war, and that'll be it.
Yeah, I saw a former CIA director on TV once say, just round up all Muslims, put them in camps in America. And that was a couple of years after 9/11.
Well, and that was the plan that Attorney General Ed Meese had. They had a plan at the Department of Justice to do that, and they were setting up camps to do that. I didn't go see the camps myself, but I do know people I work with who went out and saw these camps in the late 1980s, and they are there. I believe they've now been taken over by FEMA.
No, they have been. Yeah, that's Rex 84. Now, in closing, as you've already given us 35 minutes, Dr. Boyle, we really appreciate the time. I want to talk about some of your latest books and things that are available, and tell folks the titles of those. Very, very scholarly, but also riveting reading because it is such veritas. Specifically, an example of what one guy can do, though. You did represent a major bloc of the Balkans and was able to stop the UN in the West from breaking up Bosnia-Herzegovina and causing a new giant civil war and ethnic cleansing. That's on the record. And so it's an insight into what one guy can do, standing up and being moral, but it's also an example of the type of behavior we see from the UN and others. So briefly, tell folks that story, and then tell us about, of all the books you've written, what you think the most important reading is.
Well, for our current situation here in America, I've written 2 books that I think could get people oriented, and that would be Tackling America's Toughest Questions, Clarity Press, and then the second, Protesting Power, War, Resistance, and Law. How to use law and the Constitution to oppose further warfare here by the United States government and a police state. So I've written 15 books, but I think those would be the 2 most relevant to our current plight. And indeed, that's why I wrote those 2 books, to try to provide some light and a direction out of where we are now. Yes, as for Bosnia, sure, the United Nations and the European Union were going to carve them up into 3 little pieces, rob them of the United Nations membership, destroy them as a state, and subject 1.5 million to 2 million more Bosnians to ethnic cleansing. We already had 2 million Bosnians subjected to ethnic cleansing. And behind these plans were, of course, the Clinton administration, Mrs. Clinton, now the Secretary of State, many people working for Obama today, and Mrs. Clinton used to work for President Bill Clinton, and the British and the French. They were and the Russians as well. But they were fully prepared to simply destroy this state and wipe out all of its people. And the UN bureaucracy, all their lawyers, went along with it. And so I could just say from my personal experience, I was Bosnia's ambassador to the World Court. I stopped this from happening. But the UN bureaucracy, bureaucrats, these people are completely rotten, corrupt, despicable, unprincipled, and fortunately mediocre. All their lawyers, politicians, diplomats are pretty mediocre people. But you certainly can't trust them. And number two, however, I think we have to understand, I know there's people who in good faith believe the UN is going to take us over or UN helicopters. The UN does what we tell them to do. If Mrs. Clinton calls up Ban Ki-moon, he hops to it and says, jump, he says, how high? And the same way with his predecessor, we got these people the jobs. So they use the UN as a cutout for what their agenda is, as they did on Libya, as they just tried to do on Syria, as they've tried to do on Iran.
Sure. I mean, the imperial forces need this quasi-democratic thing that the Security Council really dictates. And of course, I mean, the military-industrial complex created it in '45 with all these promises at Presidio, based there in San Francisco. And I'm not saying the UN is going to take America over. It's that these imperial, globalist, corporate, fascist forces that created it are trying to transfer powers into it because it's their puppet to then come in, like take here at the local level and jack up taxes, to basically give it to, corporate entities like GE. And then, yes, then the UN takes the blame. But you're right, it's a total cutout.
It's a cutout. And they're not going to give up power themselves. But they use the UN as a cutout. So I don't think, there are proxies, there are stooges, there are agents, and we have to look at them that way. The whole bureaucracy there at the UN, they simply can't be trusted. But the real decisions get made in Washington, London, Paris, Brussels for the UN.
Yeah. In closing, if you notice, the generals, the colonels I talked to, the CIA people that were actually in combat in Vietnam, people that live in the real world, they're all against these wars, the drones, the police state, the NDAA. And a lot of these people, like you were saying, aren't completely moral or perfect or even good guys. They live in the real world. And so the entire military is against all these wars and where we're going. Kind of like the German military didn't want to go into Russia. Not that they were even good. It's just that they were living in the real world. Hitler wasn't. He hadn't actually been at a command level. He'd been low level in the trenches, but at least he was military to a certain extent. Now we have all these academics and people who understand statecraft, deception, manipulation, but they still don't understand the real nuts and bolts. And so you have the bureaucratic elite and the corporate owners who are becoming more and more detached from reality and who make 40-to-1 bets, like Corzine, trying to command a military and a huge system through their arrogance to launch something. And I know they're watching these shows, at least their minions are. They need to understand there's a reason the military's against this here and in Israel. There's a reason the British military's against it, because they're living in the real world. And it is so creepy. I mean, hundreds of years ago, the problem was the generals wanted wars because they'd be superstars, and the politicians had to hold them back. Now it's the other way around. The politicians are so crazy, they want to launch wars that are so huge and so dangerous, even the generals don't want a part of it. I mean, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think that, the military is used by these elites. If you read Kissinger, he had nothing but contempt for them, for the generals and the rest of them. He couldn't care less. And I think that's true for the elites, Mrs. Clinton, all the rest of them. Their children, their husbands, they don't serve in the military. So as far as they see it, they're just sort of a mercenary throwaway class to be used as they see fit.
Yeah, Kissinger called them dumb animals.